Better.
Thanks, Najo. Well, yeah, I just want to start by saying thanks to BSides for having me come and speak here, and thanks for everyone for coming to attend. As you can see on the slide here, I'm not the one that actually wrote this presentation. It was actually written by a coworker of mine down in Houston, but his wife is expecting their first child any day now, so I was asked to give it in his stay. A little bit about my background. I'm a journeyman instrumentation tech, so I was trained actually, I did some of my schooling here at SAIT and some up at NAIT. And then I got into the SCADA ICS world about 11 years ago, and then for the last kind of 6 years I've been working for a software company that's kind of specializes in communications and more recently in securing communications out to the field. So we've really kind of that's kind of how we fit into the whole ICS world. But yeah, so without further ado, we'll get into the presentation here. So first of all, we're going to go over our agenda. So what we're going to be talking about today is the kind of attacks that SCADA and ICS systems are facing, and we're going to do that using some real-world examples. We're going to talk about why some of these attacks have been succeeding. We're going to talk about why some of our attempts to thwart them have been failing. And lastly, what we can do about it. So what kind of attacks are SCADA systems facing? I'm assuming because most of you are here that cybersecurity has some importance to you. Just a quick show of hands. How many people in here could name an attack that's happened on a SCADA network that's, let's say, not Stuxnet, or more recently WannaCry, which has been, kind of all over the place. Yeah, so not very many, right? So today we're going to talk not necessarily just about kind of the what, but the why and how to fix it. So here we have a few statistics. Now I'm not going to spend a ton of time on statistics, but I do want to show a few things that show kind of the trends of where things are going. What the chart is here is from the Dell Annual Threat Report, and what it shows is that, as you can see, the trend is increasing exponentially, and this is showing the attacks on SCADA or ICS systems. North America has over 2 million pieces of field equipment, industrial field equipment on the internet. And over 90,000 of those are Modbus devices on public IPs. Now, anyone here who knows anything about Modbus protocol, I mean, it's very open, it's, you can find information about it anywhere, so, which also makes it very easy to use, which is really nice for the field guys. And public IPs, well, that's very vulnerable. So this problem is so real that both the US and Canadian federal governments have both set up ICS Cyber Emergency Response Teams, also called ICS CERT. These response teams can get called in to kind of help assess a hack, help to overcome it, and they'll help anonymize the company's data, and then from there they'll publish that information so that other companies can learn about what happened and kind of hopefully learn to defend against it. When I asked for a show of hands earlier about how many people knew about different attacks on SCADA systems, I mean, even if you try and Google them, you might be able to find 3 or 4 different ones, without I guess unless you're really, really digging. And really, there's no law that enforces reporting these hacks unless personal, financial, or medical information has been stolen. So really, a lot of these numbers that we look at are very low because of underreporting. Now, in 2016, ICS CERT reported 189 new equipment vulnerabilities. Now, what this is, we're actually vulnerabilities in the actual hardware itself. So when you're actually looking at field equipment and industrial field equipment, these are cyber vulnerabilities in the actual hardware itself. And in 2015, they responded to 295 incidents. So you talk about, finding 3 or 4 in the internet, and they responded to 295 in 2015. We don't have the numbers for 2016 yet, but based on the trend, I would assume those numbers are significantly higher. So what we have here is kind of a diagram of a typical ICS SCADA system. You've got, if we look in the top right, I guess, for you guys, we've got a couple of RTUs in the field, and they're going to send their data across a communications network, maybe to a field office there. There you got a firewall which kind of protects it, where the data can go across the internet and make its way into the corporate office so that they can do whatever they need to with that data. On the bottom is kind of the same thing. And really what it is, everything in the purple can talk to everything in the purple, right? So you've kind of got those secure boundaries. And in the middle, what we've got is this new asset that your company's just acquired, right? A lot of times companies now grow by acquisition, you gain new hardware, and we've got maybe different brands of devices out there, different types of telemetry, and so IT hasn't quite figured out what kind of a firewall they need to put on there or how they can secure it yet, but you know, they're going to get around to it eventually, right? So this is actually a vulnerability, especially when you've got new equipment that isn't being secured there, and this has already been, this type of scenario has already been exploited. So our first example we're going to talk about comes from a researcher named Kyle Wilhoit. And what he did is he worked with MIT, and what they did is they ran a test to test out the security on SCADA systems. And so they built a bunch of virtual SCADA systems and quietly put them online without telling anybody, and just kind of put them out there on public IPs. And what they found was that these systems suffered 39 unique attacks within 28 days. So these attacks were as innocent as there was an attacker from China that was sending probing commands and basically learning what the devices were based on the responses they were getting, learning about the protocols. And to as serious as an attacker, I think this one was from Iran, got onto the network and changed the maximum operating temperature from 125 degrees Fahrenheit to 425 degrees Fahrenheit and successfully logged off again. So they knew what they were doing. So there's a few implications that we can make from this. First, security by obscurity is dead. So what's security by obscurity? Well, it's kind of the idea that, you know, these guys, they can't find our equipment anyways, and if they can, they're not really going to know what to do with it, and, well, if they can, why would they want to? Well, we can see that in just 28 days, 39 unique entities were able to access the equipment and do something with it. So, you know, we can't rely on that theory anymore. So these hackers are actively hunting for these devices, and they really know what to do when they're on there. And yeah, there are even bot programs that kind of scan the internet looking for public IPs and looking for just vulnerabilities just such as this. And also with something like this too, hackers are now able to, you know, looking at this type of scenario, they're able to flank your expensive IT security system that you have set up on your corporate network and go straight for your company's moneymaker, which is the field instruments, where they can do the most damage. So another type of a hack is where a hacker compromises a user on the company network, and from there they worm their way through the network to the field equipment. So an example of this comes from a German steel mill, and where a hacker was able to infect an email on a user's computer, and from there he was able to work his way through the network onto a blast furnace. The report from the German government that came out after the fact stated that the attackers sat on the control ports, preventing the controllers from shutting it down during a critical part of the steel manufacturing process. And this resulted in a massive explosion that killed a bunch of people and injured a lot more. So it's interesting to note that the hackers merely injected themselves into the process. They didn't go in and manipulate commands. They didn't change logic. They didn't go and do a bunch of fancy stuff. They just sat there on the ports. And their mere presence on the network seemed to cause the explosion because the controllers weren't able to do what they needed to do. So the question, why didn't the safety logic kick in and take over and help fix this? Well, clearly it was unable to take something into account. So another example comes from when the field site itself is compromised, and from there a hacker can both control field equipment but can also manipulate the servers. An example of this comes from Turkey. And here a hacker was able to access a field site. And they approached the field site, they manipulated valves, disabled safety logic, overpressurized the liquid oil pipeline, and caused a massive explosion. Now, the hacker didn't just stop there. From there, they were able to worm their way up into the control network, where they were able to delete logs and history while suppressing alarms on the controller station. So the controllers didn't actually know about the pipeline explosion for 45 minutes when an operator saw smoke and called it in. This specific attack cost the company $460 million in the 3 months alone that it took them to get their pipeline up and running again, just in lost business. Now, this doesn't include repair costs, potentially any fines that they might have had to pay, or anything else like that. That was just in lost business. So this attack proves a few important things. Hackers are targeting field equipment because that's where, it's really the moneymaker, and it's where they can do the most amount of damage. It proves that destruction of field equipment can be their main goal. And they have the means and the desire to destroy our infrastructure. So control is key. How long do you guys think that this hacker was on site? Maybe a couple days, a couple of weeks? It was actually only about an hour. Third-party security footage showed an individual approaching the well site, and then about an hour later, him walking back. So this means that the focus on cybersecurity policies preventing unauthorized access to our networks should be key. Control of our network equals the safety of our network. So the last example we're going to go over here comes from when field equipment itself gets infected, and from there, like from a tech laptop or something of that nature, and it's able from there to go and affect the other devices in the field. So an example of this comes from something called PLC Blaster. And this is where there was a malware that was able to affect Siemens A-type PLCs. And from there, it would then propagate itself to other Siemens devices on the local network. Now, the interesting thing to note on this one is it did that using the PLC's native protocol. So it's not always exploiting a vulnerability in the PLC, but it can be using a feature that's built in against the users. So this shows that with cybersecurity, sometimes that all the hackers need is really to gain access to the equipment, and then from there use the equipment, and then do whatever they need to from there, or what they want to from there. So from a safety perspective, what's the difference between an accident and a hack attack? Or it's the outcome, right? If a facility or a pipeline explodes or leaks, and how are you going to prove to your boss, shareholders, or a regulatory body that this pipeline explosion that just killed a few civilians and injured some others was not the result of negligence necessarily, but was from a hack? Already there's been roughly about 1,000 deaths from SCADA hacking since the early 2000s. And it's not always these big flashy events like some of the examples I talked about. It can be as small as someone going online and taking an H2S analyzer offline, which of course is very, very dangerous. So the issues hacking has brought on with SCADA get to the core of our business. Hackers undermine the assumptions that we make about safety. One, that we're the only ones manipulating the network, and two, that the data that we're making these decisions off of is reliable. So did the controllers of the Turkish pipeline make a mistake when they didn't back off the pressure on that pipeline? Well, no, because they didn't know it was overpressurized in the first place. Creating effective cyber policies can be seen as a continuation of a company's safety efforts, and I would say they should become a part of their safety policy. So why are attacks on SCADA able to succeed? So here we have an average SCADA network. We've got your RTU and PLC, and data is going to transfer over a field network. It's going to hit a gateway firewall and make it to HMI where they're going to do whatever they need to with that data. And from there, the network is air-gapped from another firewall to the corporate network to take it off the internet. So at what point does the network stop being SCADA and start becoming IT? Well, everybody draws the line differently, but the line needs to be drawn. Sometimes people will draw it at the gateway firewall, some at the HMI, and some wherever the air gap is. But really, when it comes down to it, this line can get very fuzzy. So let's take the HMI station as an example. So let's say you've got your control room operator. He's trying to get data from a field device, and he's not able to get it. Who's he going to call? Is he going to call IT? Well, not likely. He's going to probably call his local SCADA guys. They're going to take a look at it. They're going to troubleshoot. If they can't figure it out, then they'll call in a field tech who might go and look at the communications out in the field. And then at the end of it, if nothing else works, if they think about it even, they might contact IT. And what if IT is blocking access to the port that's getting that data? Who's going to win that battle? Well, SCADA is, because they need to get their data to do their job. So what happens if then an attack comes through on that unsecured port that they just opened up? Who's liable? So one of the issues when trying to apply an IT solution to a SCADA process is that each department really has different priorities. With SCADA, the number one priority is safety, where the availability of data is key for them to do their job. IT's main priority is confidentiality and controlling access to the corporate network. So why are they different? So SCADA equipment isn't necessarily designed to be secure. Oftentimes this equipment is older than the internet itself. If not, then it's likely older than most of the attacks that we're running into. SCADA equipment can kind of be seen as a static defense against the elements, right? It's designed to work under certain operating pressures and temperatures and so on. And those things don't change. Whereas when it comes to cybersecurity, the culprit is not the environment, it's people, right? And the attack and the threat landscape is ever changing. So the field equipment aren't safety devices, and I really don't think that they should be. They're designed to do a specific job and to do it safely and reliably. Vendors who make transmitters and sensors can't suddenly make a security product, and if they did, they wouldn't be making their product better, they'd be making it more difficult to use. Also, SCADA equipment is designed to last a long time, and eventually it's going to become a vulnerability when it comes to the cybersecurity side. An example is that ICS CERT found hidden undocumented ports in numerous different Ethernet-based PLCs. A lot of times these ports were put in on purpose from developers to be able to update firmware or do maintenance on these devices, just kind of having a backdoor in. Now this is a serious vulnerability. Those things, a lot of times people don't even know about them, but when they do become known, they're all of a sudden a vulnerability or a target. So safety logic, as we talked about with the one with the blast furnace that went there, safety logic is not security logic. It's there to protect equipment from automation, not from a cyber attack. If a malicious user knows what they're doing, they can likely even go in and change the security logic or make other changes that will make it so that the safety logic won't work. People also love to air gap, which is also kind of isolating the network from the internet. Pictured here on the bottom is a guy named Sean McGurk, and at the time he was working for the Department of Homeland Security, and he did an audit of major U.S. energy companies that were using air gapping as part of their security policy. And what he found, and I quote, is, "In no case have we ever found the operations network, the SCADA system, or the energy management system separated from the enterprise network." Now, air gapping can be a part of your security policy. What I'm saying is it shouldn't be your security policy. So how does this affect cybersecurity policies? Here's an analogy that's going to kind of help us get through the rest of the presentation. A cybersecurity policy is kind of like a pane of glass. It's designed to protect us from the things outside and is crafted to work properly in a specific frame. So on the left here, what we have is an IT security policy, right? It's sleek, it's uniform, and it's designed to work in a nice uniform square frame. On the right, we have a SCADA IT policy, a lot more antiquated, a little more legacy, and very custom. So what happens when you try and force the IT security pane into the SCADA frame? Well, the glass breaks. IT likes to quickly apply security updates to servers and individual machines. For SCADA, this is difficult. A lot of times you have multiple servers, you can't take a process offline, and as such you have to schedule downtime to make security updates. And because of air gapping, these updates are important, but they're not critical. So a lot of times too, the SCADA will schedule updates either quarterly, biannually, or sometimes only once a year. So I mean, these things aren't happening very frequently. And so this is the first crack in applying IT solutions to SCADA security problems. Another IT security strategy is conformity of hardware. So I bet that anyone's company here, they're not likely going to have people running Macs and PCs and Chromebooks and Linux operating systems. No, they're going to be putting out, everybody's going to have the same type of, likely even laptop or hardware. They're going to be running the same operating system, same virus scanning utilities. Everything's going to be the same. Now with SCADA, this is really hard to do. You got a lot of devices that are geographically dispersed. A lot of companies grow by acquisition. Different well sites need different things or different, field. I speak a lot to oil and gas because it's my experience, but ICS is more than just that. But I mean, you got all these different processes that will require different hardware. And so it's really hard to create a copy-paste IT solution for that type of network. And thus another crack forms in the pane. So lastly, IT generally has the ability to restrict access to its equipment. For many people, or how many people here, unless you're an IT security or IT manager, could take a USB stick that I give you and go and plug it into your company's email server? Not likely, right? And if you were an IT manager and did that, then that probably you'd probably be fired. Now with SCADA, you've got all this equipment that's geographically dispersed. It's all over the place, and likely thousands of different pieces. And so it's really hard to control access to every single piece. And this breaks the panel altogether. So here's where we are now. We have IT security tools, but we have SCADA security problems. So we need to focus on the actionable to achieve the doable. So there's so many what ifs. We need to really focus on where the attacks are going to happen and what we can do about it. And when we implement these things, we got to make sure that we're not going to build this big plan that nobody's going to be able to implement or want to implement, and it's going to be impossible to maintain, right? So you have to make something that can be implemented. And lastly, your cybersecurity policy is an enterprise-wide opportunity. All your groups, different groups within the enterprise of your company, need to come together to try and find the best solution that fits for everybody. Share your experiences. So what should a SCADA cybersecurity policy do? So there are dozens of guides for making great cybersecurity policy. On the image here that nobody can read is from the ICSO CERT website, and it's what it is tens of thousands of pages of documents on how to build a great policy. NIST has a great policy that's used all over the place, but the problem is that they really make no specific technology recommendations on how to implement. ISA also has great documentation on how to approach ICS cybersecurity. However, there's two parts of the paper, use cases and how to implement, that haven't been written yet. And I actually think one of them has been taken off of their list that they were going to put in. So I'm not here to necessarily cover these policies. They're more the how, and they're very good for talking about that. But what I'm here to talk about a little bit is more the what. I want to talk about the technology that we can take to the test lab to deploy out into the field. So when selecting technologies to deploy, where should they go? We need to identify the assets that are under attack. So based on the examples that we've talked about, this means securing the field equipment. We need to focus on preventative measures and prevent access to the networks. Mitigation is good, but as we saw from some of the examples, they don't need long to destroy our equipment. So remember, SCADA hardware also has no backups. You got an IT system, and if someone takes out a server at the host, yeah, it might be a lot of work, but with backups and everything, you can get something up and going pretty quickly. But I bet you no one out there has a backup pipeline or a backup plant that can be brought online if something goes wrong there. So there's no backups on that side. So controlling access to the equipment is really the only way to achieve these goals. So therefore, we need to deploy our security solution to the field. After all, it's where the attackers are going after. To emphasize this point, I have an analogy, and you'll like the graphic. So imagine you're a farmer, and there's a rabbit that's coming in, and he's eating the stuff out of your garden, taking all your produce. Are you going to build a fence around your house where you store the vegetables after you've harvested them out of the ground, or are you going to build the fence around your garden? Well, kind of obvious, right? The garden. Now, what we need to do is also deploy this kind of thinking to how we protect our SCADA and ICS systems. So the only way our plan, our field-ready technology is going to work is if it can be implemented. Sorry, I lost my place here. So it needs to be designed to fit into our process. So to continue with the window analogy, what we have here is on the left is the SCADA policy. It's wide open so that data can kind of come in and out freely. Now IT comes along and they want to control access, right? They see the window wide open, so what do? They close the window and they nail it shut. Well, field technician comes along, he can't get his data, so what does he do? He pries the window open. So the best solution should have been installing a latch on the window, right? So data can come in and out when needed and be closed when it's not needed to be open. So one of the best ways to do this is through encryption. Encryption is a process of encoding data so only the right people can read it, and so it can't be manipulated in transit. I like it because it scales both functionality and technology. Whether you've got one device or thousands out there, the implementation is the same. And there's also different levels of implementation for encryption. Encryption is great because it's open source, so you're not stuck into something proprietary from a specific vendor. And it can also be deployed using I went too far, sorry. Using a PKI, which is a public key infrastructure, or certificates. This allows you to control who's allowed on the encrypted network by requiring user to have a valid certificate and also to have the password for that. And this is two factors of portable authentication across the whole entire network. So manipulating our data, because encryption prevents unauthorized users from manipulating our data, ensures the integrity of the data. And this is really half that battle that we talked about earlier, that we need accurate data to make these decisions off of. So to kind of bring this all down to a point, what I'm advocating at this point is that we have a dedicated security device that's deployed in the field at the most upstream point possible. So that's kind of what I have on the bottom here. So you've got a device all the way down at the bottom. So this has many benefits. So first, this kind of pushes the IT strategy or the IT's defense in depth strategy down to the lowest level of vulnerability. It creates modern security solutions deeper in the network and into the OT SCADA side than is normally possible with VPN. Chances are you have a firewall to protect your company network and you have antivirus on all your different machines. And so this kind of deploys that type of thinking down into the field, to the actual field equipment itself. So this secures the entire data transfer with certificate and password. So depending on the device, some also provide networking logs at the device level. So this provides an auditable trail of your network to prove if an incident was a hack attempt and not just a safety violation. It helps to extend the investment that you guys have made. For example, if you have one of those PLCs that has one of those backdoor ports, and your security is down at the field level like that, if you didn't know about that port, you didn't whitelist it through, so there's no access. So if someone gains access to your network, they can't take advantage of that vulnerable port. So one of the best standards for deployable encryption device is something called FIPS. So FIPS is basically a series of best practices to deploy specific cybersecurity technologies. And it was designed by the US and Canadian governments, and it's actually required by the US government for critical but non-classified communication. So what does that mean? This picture on the bottom looks a little grainy, but what it is just it's from the FIPS Proof website, and what it is, it details a radio that gets used for US military communications. Okay, so with that, anytime the US military uses devices for communications, they have to be FIPS validated, whether that's through the Air Force, Navy, and or Army. So you can't have any back doors, right? You don't want mission critical communications going on and someone's listening through a backdoor port that a developer put in, right? So a FIPS validation does not allow that. So here's a bit of what FIPS. So it gives you kind of two user levels. So one for kind of your average user that needs to get data from the devices on the other end of it, and another one for an administrator that needs to configure the device itself. There are two forms of encryption and PKIs for a good balance between security and speed of communication. So what this does is it means that you're not going to have any noticeable lag on your communications. A lot of old implementations of encryption produce a considerable amount of lag on communications just because of the overhead. This type of deployment of encryption that FIPS requires, which again is an open standard, helps to make that lag so it's not noticeable. So each FIPS device is considered a secure boundary, which means it's not allowed to have any backdoors. And there's also even no hardware openings for updating firmware on the hardware devices itself. So there's no way to kind of plug in and actually get into the device. They must have a clear indication that they're configured correctly, usually a light on them. So this means that the default passwords have been changed. How many times does that not happen? And that there's been a new PKI installed. This also forces compliance because if a FIPS device isn't configured correctly, it's not going to work. So this screenshot comes from a vendor's website after being hit by a malware called Mirai. Now, when Mirai, what it does is it hits modems on public IPs with default passwords. And when it gets onto one of these modems, it racks up a bunch of data, and so all these customers get a ton of huge phone bills. Now, it's interesting to note that this only affects these devices that had default passwords. So it just kind of brings that to a point again that change your passwords. So there are also some criticisms of FIPS. One major one is that it inhibits development. This is because it roughly costs about $80,000 to get a device FIPS validated, and that process can take about I think it's about 2 to 6 months. And most changes that you make to a FIPS device will invalidate the certification. So does this not inhibit innovation? Well, I would say that FIPS devices will actually drastically improve the security on our networks. Currently, they're not being supported at all. What's pictured here is an Allen Bradley Micrologix 1000 PLC. When's the last time you guys think this thing had a security update? Never, and it will never have one. FIPS validation also only lasts 5 years before something needs to be recertified. The process for validation, or the requirements for validation, is actually updated monthly to constantly reflect the threat, the ever-changing threat landscape. Devices can be updated and also recertified as well. So FIPS devices will be secure because their main customer is the military. So General McScada over here is not going to buy some device that's going to be vulnerable for 6 months at a time while he's waiting for an update because it needs to get recertified, right? So FIPS devices can be updated when needed and can also have a fast-track certification for a recertification. These FIPS or these fixes are also on a FIPS device are allowed to be deployed before recertification to fix any holes, so that so you're not getting these. If a new vulnerability is exposed, you can actually put out the fix to close that gap and then go and get recertified on it. It's designed to be to work that way. Now, it's important to follow some type of a cybersecurity standard when you're applying, encryption to devices and things like that. This is because of a valuable lesson that was learned because of Stuxnet. Now, Stuxnet was a virus that hit an Iranian nuclear facility. And what it would do is it would record good data back, and then it would play that back at another time to disguise a hack. Now, it took 2.5 years before the company found the Stuxnet virus on their equipment. When they finally published it and made it known that this was happening, the hardware vendor denied it, that its devices had been attacked for 6 months. When they finally admitted it, it took them at least 2 years to come out with a fix for it. So they waited 5 years before that thing was patched. And how many people do you think actually heard about the patch or deployed it to begin with? Kind of brings that point up again that SCADA equipment vendors cannot and should not be forced to becoming cybersecurity vendors. Now, FIPS isn't just about the cutting edge either. There are some FIPS devices out there that have support for legacy devices or communications like serial. An example of this is pictured here, and this was from a review of the U.S. government's technology, and it finds that the U.S.'s ballistic nuclear missile program still runs off of 8-inch floppy disks. This is supposed to be upgraded by the end of the year, but that's a little scary. So, in conclusion, we need to add cybersecurity to our company's safety policies. Without accurate data and controlled access, our sites are not safe. SCADA is being successfully targeted by hackers, and our current efforts to thwart those attacks have been failing. And to create a secure network, we need a cybersecurity policy that focuses on preventing access to our field equipment, defends the field equipment, and uses encryption to defend the network. One of the best technologies to do this, in my opinion, is FIPS. So that's my presentation. I think I have some time for a few questions, if there are any. I think we got a mic that's going to come around.
All right. Oh. So what's kind of cute about, or awesome, I think, is this is Lee's instructor from 10 years ago. So how cool is that to student and teacher?
All right, Lee, I'll give you your homework later. I'm curious to know what's the prevention with the device the encryption device right next to the RTU? How do you account for firmware upgrades? Like we're saying that the PLC never gets an update, but I would actually beg to differ. There's typically some firmware upgrades, there's some system software upgrades. Could you comment on that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was talking about updates, I was talking about a security update for the PLC, but and those don't normally happen. But when it comes to firmware updates, some of these devices that are available now to deploy at that level are protocol agnostic. It doesn't matter what's going through them. So if you've got vendor software that can communicate over a network, you can actually do those firmware updates remotely and securely, because anything going through that device, if it's a device that follows that kind of standard, should be encrypted. So you can do that remotely. Otherwise, I mean, some of those devices you actually have to physically go there and do that on site. But it's that kind of appliance in the middle that doesn't have that port open for doing security. A FIPS device itself doesn't. And so, yeah, I don't say that necessarily the hardware like the PLC should be FIPS validated, but that maybe something third party that's between the PLC and the telemetry, that's where the FIPS validated security should be. And that device itself shouldn't have any ports for that.
Answer your question? Okay. Oh.
In terms of implementation, do you have any interesting stories on key management for encryption, for example, either in management and acquisition, merger and acquisitions, or some remote sites that are really lean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but from what I think on that, I mean, you're going to run into all different types of communications that are out there. You know, your communication link has to be strong enough to send that out. And if you do have the deployable encryption that uses the mix that's recommended by FIPS, because there's no additional lag really that's noticeable, if your communication link is strong enough to get across the data that you need to for that remote firmware update, you should be able to do it across that network. Now, use cases as far as remotely doing firmware, I don't really have any of those. I mean, I've seen lots of companies are doing remote configuration through these connections, but personally, I haven't seen a firmware update through it, so I can't comment on that. So I don't know. I might not have understood the question. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Biswinger.
So one of the things I got out of your talk, you said they break in and within an hour they did whatever they needed and they got out. So if I think on the corporate side, we'll often have a SOC and we'll have a SIM and there'll be an alert and we'll do an incident response and all of that. So there's some time associated with doing that kind of incident response. If you're saying we can come in and blow up a pipeline within an hour, that doesn't sound like we have time to do incident response. So is the focus on ICS more about it has to be prevention? And we of course do incident response, but can we not rely on it on ICS the way we would on the corporate side? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that incident response is important. It's definitely important, but just with some of the examples that we're seeing and how advanced some of these hackers are becoming, how quick they can do their work if they really know what they're doing on the network, preventing access has to be a huge part of that. I know a lot of my talk was on the communication side and the encryption side of it, but I mean, when you're coming up with a cybersecurity policy for an organization, I think you need to also make sure you identify those assets that could cause a lot more damage, and making sure there's physical security at those sites too. And I mean, if someone's going to try and really break into something, there's usually ways to do it, but even if you can slow that down, whether you've got a fence around it or some of these devices have DIO on them, so you can alarm if someone opens a cabinet, so you can send an operator out to, hey, you need to check this right away because someone's opened a gate or a cabinet or something like that. So I'm just saying more that preventative has to, I think, the incident response is very important, but I think there needs to be a greater emphasis put on preventing access when it comes to the ICS networks.
I'm scared of this thing. Does it like me? Anyone else? I don't want to move, but I will. I'm coming up. I'm going in.
Well, I'll be around for a bit. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to come and approach me. I'm going to be around tomorrow too. So.
Thanks so much, Lee. Really appreciate it. Next session's at 2:15. Big warm thank you for Lee presenting someone else's deck, which is always such a challenge. So thanks for being here. It was great to meet you.
Yeah,
All right.
Thanks, everyone.